Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 11, The Peace Treaties. Though we had peace, yet 'twill be a great white ere things be settled. Though the wind lie, yet after a storm the sea will work a great while. Selden's Table Talk. However keen may be the feelings excited by the distribution of tropical colonies, of compensation in money or in kind, and of retributive justice, high as are the hopes centered in the League of Nations, it is by the territorial settlements in Europe that the treaties of 1919 and 1920 will finally be judged. Here we are in contact with those deep and lasting facts which cast races of men into molds and fix their place and status in the world. Here we stir the embers of the past and light the beacons of the future. Old flags are raised anew. The passions of vanished generations awake. Beneath the shell-torn soil of the 20th century, the bones of long-dead warriors and victims are exposed, and the wail of lost causes sounds in the wind. The treaties with which we now have to deal take their place in the great series, which includes the Treaty of Westphalia, the Treaty of Utrecht, and the treaties of Vienna. They are at once the latest and the largest link in the chain of European history. They will be memorable for three events of the first magnitude: the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rebirth of Poland, and the preservation of united Germany. Even the short distance we have traveled since the conference in Paris reveals the scale of these monarch peaks, and how they tower above the range and dominate the wide regions of mountainous and hilly country. Already, through the clearer air, we can discern the proportions of the vast landscape and its massive simplicity. The empire of Charles V, and with it the Habsburg monarchy, the survivor of so many upheavals, the main structure of Central and Southern Europe, is represented only by a chasm. The three sundered parts of Poland are reunited into a sovereign independent republic of 30 million souls, and Germany, beaten and disarmed upon the field of battle, defenseless before her outraged conquerors, rises the largest and incomparably the strongest racial mass in Europe. These dominant facts in the life of Europe did not spring solely, or even mainly, from the volcanic violence of the war. They were the result of the methodical application of a principle. If the treaty makers of Vienna in 1814 were ruled by the principle of legitimacy, those of Paris in 1919 were guided by the principle of self-determination. Although the expression self-determination will rightly be forever connected with the name of President Wilson, the ideal was neither original nor new. The phrase itself is Fichte's Selbstbestimmung. The conception has never been more forcefully presented than by Mazzini. Throughout the British Empire it had long been known and widely practiced under the somewhat less explosive precepts of self-government and government by consent. During the 19th century, the rise of nationalism made it increasingly plain that all great empires must reckon with this principle and increasingly conform to it, if they were to survive united and vital in the modern world. The almost complete exclusion of religion in all its forms from the political sphere had left nationalism the most powerful moulding instrument of mankind in temporal affairs. The 14 points embodied and proclaimed the principle of self-determination. In his speeches, the President had declared that national aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. Peoples and provinces are not to be bartered about from sovereignty to sovereignty. Every territorial settlement must be made in the interest and for the benefit of the populations concerned. All well-defined and national aspirations shall be accorded the utmost satisfaction that can be accorded them without introducing new and perpetuating old elements of discord and antagonism. The Allies had earnestly identified their war aims with this declaration. The Germans had accompanied their requests for an armistice by the conditions that the peace settlement should be based upon the 14 points of President Wilson and his other speeches. They had even claimed that they laid down their arms and rendered themselves defenseless upon this understanding. Therefore, the principle of self-determination was at once what the victors had fought for and the vanquished claimed. Here was one clear guiding principle upon which all the peoples so cruelly sundered, so torn with wounds and hatreds, were united, and to which all were bound both by faith and interest. The main and imperative duty of the Peace Conference in all matters comprised in their task of making peace between the belligerents was to give effect to this principle, or in words which I venture to requote, to liberate the captive nationalities, to reunite those branches of the same family which had long been arbitrarily divided, and to draw frontiers in broad accordance with the ethnic masses. All being agreed upon the fundamental principle, it remained to apply it. But if the principle was simple and accepted, its application was difficult and disputable. What was to be the test of nationality? How were the wishes of national elements to be expressed and obtained? How and where were the resulting frontiers to be drawn amid entangled populations? To what extent should the main principle override every other consideration, historical, geographical, economic, or strategic? How far could the armed and vehement forces, which were everywhere afoot, be brought to accept the resulting decisions? Such were the problems of the Peace Conference, and in particular of the Triumvirate. In the main it was decided that language should be adopted as the proof of nationality. No doubt language is not always its manifestation. Some of the most nationally conscious stocks can scarcely speak their own language at all, or only with the greatest difficulty. Some oppressed races spoke the language of their oppressors, while hating them, and some dominant breeds spoke the language of their subjects, while ruling them. Still, matters had to be settled with reasonable dispatch, and no better guide to the principle of nationality in disputed cases could be found than language, or, as a last resort, a plebiscite. It was inherent in the realities that the scheme of drawing frontiers in accordance with nationality as defined by language or with the wish of the local inhabitants could not in practice be applied without modification. Some of the new states had no access to the sea through their own populations, and could not become effective economic units without such access. Some liberated nationalities had for centuries looked forward to regaining the ancient frontiers of their long-vanished sovereignty. Some of the victors were entitled by treaty to claim, and others of the victors bound by treaty to accord them, frontiers fixed not by language or the wish of the inhabitants, but by Alps. Some integral economic communities lay athwart the ethnic frontier, and at many points rival and hostile races were intermingled, not only as individuals, but by villages, by townships, and by rural districts. All this debatable ground had to be studied and fought over mile by the numerous, powerful, and violently agitated states concerned. Nevertheless, all these reservations and impingements upon the fundamental principle affected only the outskirts of peoples and countries. All the disputable areas put together were but a minute fraction of Europe. They were but the exceptions which proved the rule. Fierce as were and are the irritations which have arisen wherever these sensitive and doubtful fringes of nationality have been roughly clipped by frontier's scissors, they do not impair the broad essence of the treaties. Probably less than 3% of the European population are now living under governments whose nationality they repudiate, and the map of Europe has for the first time been drawn in general harmony with the wishes of its peoples. Let us now test these assertions by examining the actual frontiers of Germany fixed by the Treaty of Versailles. Let us begin with the western and northern frontiers. Point 8 of the 14 stated that the wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine, which has unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years, should be righted. This had become one of the prime objects of the Allies after the war had broken out. It was explicitly accepted by Germany when she asked for peace on the basis of the 14 points and signed the armistice accordingly. There was therefore no dispute about Alsace-Lorraine. These two provinces, after being French for nearly 200 years, had been wrested from France in 1871 against the wishes of their inhabitants. They had been, to use the word embodied in the treaty, separated from their country in spite of the solemn protests of their representatives at the Assembly of Bordeaux. The retrocession of Alsace-Lorraine was the repairing of a breach in the principle of self-determination committed within living memory. Apart from an insignificant alteration of the Belgian frontier around Eupen and Malmedy, no other change was made in the western frontiers of Germany. The French had vehemently claimed, in addition to Alsace and Lorraine, the annexation of the district of the Saar with its very valuable coalfields. They founded their claim at first upon historical grounds. President Wilson's refusal to endorse it, against the reputed wish of the inhabitants, led to one of the notable crises in the discussion of the triumvirate. The French then fell back upon a demand for the temporary use of the coalfields in the Saar Valley to compensate them for the destruction of the French mining districts at Lens and Valenciennes. They themselves proposed that the ultimate destination of the Saar Valley should be determined by the vote of the inhabitants themselves, taken in the year 1935. There are no grounds whatever of principle upon which the resulting agreement of the conference can be assailed. Upon the northern or Danish frontier, one other cession of territory was required of Germany. When, after the defeat of Denmark by Prussia in 1864, Schleswig and Holstein were surrendered by Denmark to Prussia and Austria, a clause had been inserted at the instance of Napoleon III in the treaty, that the inhabitants of northern Schleswig should be consulted upon whether they desired to be Danish or German. This only accorded with justice. The Duchy of Holstein was and had always been purely German. The south of Schleswig had been gradually Germanized, but the north remained Danish in speech and Danish in sentiment. The stipulation of the treaty had never been carried out. The inhabitants of northern Schleswig were never consulted, and Prussia had at a later date freed herself from the legal obligation. Now was clearly the time to repair this injustice and the permanent estrangement between Denmark and Germany which had resulted from it. There were some who would have desired that the whole of Schleswig should be separated from Germany, in order so to arrange the frontier that the Kiel Canal should cease to run entirely through German territory. The prudence of the Danish government set all such designs on one side. They desired to receive into the Danish nation only those districts whose people felt themselves to be Danes. They rejected all suggestions that a German-speaking population should be unwillingly incorporated in Denmark. Accordingly, it was agreed that the future frontiers should be drawn by the free vote of the population given in a plebiscite. Let us now turn to the eastern frontier of Germany. Here we encounter one of the great new facts. Only a prodigy could have brought about the rebirth of Poland. Before that event could come to pass, it was necessary that every single one of the three military empires which had partitioned Poland should be simultaneously and decisively defeated in war, or otherwise shattered. If the powers which had devoured Poland stood together in a Dreikaiserbund, there was no force in the world which would or could have challenged them. If they warred on opposite sides, at least one would emerge among the victors and could not be despoiled of its possessions. But the astounding triple event had occurred. Russia had shattered Austria, the Bolsheviks, aided by Germany, had destroyed Russia, and Germany herself had been overpowered by France and the English-speaking world. So all three parts of sundered Poland were free at the same moment, and all their chains, Russian, German, and Austrian, fell to the ground in a single clash. The hour of destiny had struck, and the largest crime of European history, triumphantly persisted in through 6 generations, was now to pass away. Point 13 had declared that an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea. Germany had accepted this. Indeed, her own claim for ethnic integrity was based upon the very principle which recreated the ancient state of Poland. But with the best will in the world, the drawing of a frontier between Germany and Poland could not be free from anomaly and injustice. The great plain, which stretched from Warsaw to Berlin, was marked by no physical barrier. Along a belt of 400 miles, the population was mixed in varying proportions. It had been the policy of Germany to colonize Poland with German settlers. German capital, science, and ability had created a vigorous industrial life. Their culture, thrust forward with the power of an armed and militant empire, had everywhere made its impression upon the conquered and partitioned population. The Germans pointed to the obvious benefits which their rule had conferred on Prussian Poland. The Poles declared that this was the mere usufruct of a stolen inheritance. It was the task of the Peace Conference, of the Poland Commission, and finally of the Triumvirate to draw the line. The problem divided itself into 3 sections: the center, the north, and the south. The task of the Poland Commission was to determine which districts were inhabited by an indisputably Polish population. Plebiscites were convenient for well-marked districts, but no plebiscite was possible throughout this great belt of country whose boundaries were indefinite. To seek such a plebiscite would have involved occupying the whole area by impartial British, French, and American troops. But the Americans were going home. The British had demobilized so fast that they could scarcely spare half a dozen battalions, and the French avowed themselves Polish champions. In the center, therefore, which broadly comprised the Prussian province of Posen, the only basis was the German statistics. No doubt these were more than discounted by the not unnatural anti-German bias of the victors. But upon the whole, the line was drawn with the desire to assign to Germany the fewest possible number of Poles, and to Poland the fewest possible number of Germans. More difficulty arose in the north. The province of East Prussia, though originally in the nature of a German colonial conquest, had become a purely German land, whose population was animated above all other parts of Germany by the spirit of intense nationalism. This province was separated from the rest of Germany by a strip or corridor running down to the sea, in which, from all accounts, there appeared to be a Polish-speaking majority. The Poles demanded large portions of East Prussia from Germany, and for the rest suggested that this small island of German people should be made a republic with its capital at Königsberg. This demand was rejected, but the Polish-speaking corridor was joined to Poland, not only on grounds of language, but as the most obvious means of giving Poland that access to the sea which had been accepted by all parties to the 14 points. Adjoining the corridor was the great city of Danzig, inhabited by 200,000 Germans, which was the natural outlet to the sea for the whole trade of the valley of the Vistula. The Commission originally proposed to transfer Danzig absolutely to Polish sovereignty, so that the inhabitants of Danzig would be subject to Polish legislation and to compulsory service in the Polish army. Through Mr. Lloyd George's exertions, a solution was found by which Danzig was restored to the old position it had held for 500 years as a self-governing civic state. United by close ties with Poland, but with autonomous sovereign control over its whole internal administration and government. Danzig was to be a free city, but it was to enter the Polish custom system, and the Poles were to have the administration of the great harbor. This ingenious and complicated expedient did not give complete satisfaction to either side, but it is not easy to see what better method could have been adopted. In this northern section of the frontier, two minor points of difficulty must be mentioned. East Prussia had been preserved to Germany, but certain districts on its southern borders contained considerable Polish-speaking populations and were claimed by Poland. For these districts of Allenstein and Marienwerder, a plebiscite was prescribed. The majority voted to remain with Germany, and their wish was law. Lastly, the small port and district of Memel, situated on the other side of the river Niemen, was the only means by which Lithuania could obtain that outlet to the sea without which it could not exist as an independent state. It was hoped that the Lithuanians would voluntarily join themselves once more to Poland. This they refused, and could not be compelled. Thus, eventually, Memel, a German town of about 30,000 inhabitants, surrounded by rural districts largely Lithuanian-speaking, was assigned to Lithuania, under elaborate securities for local autonomy. We have still to consider the southern section of the German-Polish frontier, and here, upon the question of Upper Silesia, another of the great disputes of the conference occurred. The draft treaty presented to the Germans prescribed the absolute cession of Upper Silesia, after the Ruhr, the richest iron and coal district in the German Empire, to the Poles. This was the greatest blot upon the draft treaty with Germany. The rest was implicit in the acceptance of the 14 points. But the enforced cession of the whole of Upper Silesia was received with vehement German resentment and indeed with general surprise. The conflicts of the triumvirate, now rejoined by Italy, which had marked the framing of the preliminary peace terms, did not end with their presentation to Germany. The Germans protested by every means in their power against the financial and economic clauses, against the clauses compelling their avowal of war guilt and the surrender of war criminals. In the territorial sphere, they complained chiefly of the cession of Upper Silesia. It seemed possible that they would refuse to sign the treaty, and thus force the Allies into a military occupation of Berlin and other important centers, or a prolongation of the blockade, or both. Such a course presented no immediate military difficulty, but very grave political dangers. No one could tell how long an occupation would last. Until it ended, very large numbers of soldiers must be kept under arms and further demobilization indefinitely suspended. On June 1, Mr. Lloyd George, wishing to strengthen himself in his efforts to obtain a mitigation of the peace terms, convened a meeting in Paris of the British Empire delegation. The whole empire was represented together with the principal British departments of state. General Smuts made a powerful appeal for clemency. When my turn came, I supported him by arguments of a different character. As Secretary of State for War, I had a special point of view. I stated that there were the most serious difficulties either in reimposing the blockade or in governing the whole territory of Germany and undertaking the solving of local political problems. A foreign garrison would never make the Germans work unitedly and effectively. The weapons of blockade and occupation were mutually exclusive. If you occupied the country, you would have to feed the people in the territory held, and this could not be done under blockade. If the Allies entered Germany and occupied the country, it would be necessary to have conscription indefinitely. It was impossible to control the internal life of Germany without maintaining compulsory service for Great Britain. The pressure to obtain the release of men from the army was already indescribable. The very classes who were calling most loudly for extreme terms to be imposed upon Germany were those who were the most anxious to get men out of the army. Accordingly, I urged that further negotiations should take place and implored the delegation to cast their opinion in the direction of giving their plenipotentiaries the greatest possible liberty to make a split the difference peace on the points outstanding. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Chamberlain, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Birkenhead, and others spoke to the same purpose. Although there were many gradations of opinion, the will of the delegation was unanimous. It was resolved that the Prime Minister in his negotiations should press for concessions to be made to the enemy in the Treaty of Peace. In particular, amendment of the proposals for the eastern frontier of Germany, leaving to Germany districts preponderantly German and providing for a plebiscite in doubtful cases. Extension to Germany of the right to enter the League of Nations at an early date, reduction in the numerical strength of the Army of Occupation, modification of the reparation clauses, and the fixing of the German liability at a definite amount. The delegation, in a mood of strong conviction, further authorized the Prime Minister, in the event of resistance on the part of any of his colleagues on the Council of Four, to use the full weight of the entire British Empire, even to the point of refusing the services of the British Army to advance into Germany, or the services of the British Navy to enforce the blockade of Germany. This seemed to be a memorable occasion. Mr. Lloyd George was thus strongly armed for all the future discussions, and he would probably have succeeded in improving the treaty in an ever greater degree, but for his burden of reparation pledges. The crazy echoes of the general election were a humiliating handicap both to the Prime Minister and Great Britain. Clemenceau, Wilson, and Orlando understood the position perfectly. When Wilson was rallied with placing Germans under Polish, Czechoslovak, or Italian rule, when Clemenceau was reproached for vindictiveness or Orlando for territorial appetite, each had his retort. A sarcastic smile, a shrug of the shoulders, some reference to the difficulties of democratic electioneering were quite sufficient to place the Big Four upon an equality and at a lower level. All the time, the odd fact was that however many thousand millions Germany paid, Great Britain had only to receive a very small fraction, less than half the share of France, and subject to Belgian priority. And that, scarcely 2 years later, she was to proclaim the principle, revived from the wisdom of an aristocratic past, that all war debts ought to be simultaneously extinguished by universal consent, with consequent reactions upon reparations. A prolonged conflict ensued about Silesia. President Wilson and the French championed the claims of Poland. England asserted the rights of Germany and invoked the principle of self-determination. The president's bias in favor of Poland was as marked as his prejudices against the Italians. Cynics pointed to the fact that Italian emigrants to America usually returned to Italy without acquiring voting rights, while the Polish vote was a formidable factor in the domestic politics of the United States. Be this as it may, Mr. Wilson had made up his mind that Poland should have Upper Silesia, and he resented all opposition. However, in this field Mr. Lloyd George was unhampered by British electioneering, and in spite of the persistent attacks of the Northcliffe press, his efforts and persuasion prevailed. The principle of a plebiscite was conceded to the Germans in the final treaty, which is thus cleared from reproach in this respect. It is worthwhile to describe briefly the outcome. The plebiscite was eventually held in 1920 under the authority of British and French troops. While these were occupying the disputed zones and preparing for the voting, a violent incursion of Poles under one Korfanty, a former Polish deputy of the Reichstag, was organized with the object of preventing the election. The Germans were not slow to retaliate with a similar inroad. A sort of civil war broke out in which British troops sympathized with the Germans and the French with the Poles. Matters thus came to a dangerous and ludicrous pass. However, law and good sense prevailed. The plebiscite was duly taken, and a German majority of 6-4 declared itself. When these results were brought before the Supreme Council, no agreement could be reached. The Americans had gone home, and England and France were in obstinate equipoise. The deadlock was resolved by an agreement to refer the issue to the Council of the League of Nations. This was the first occasion upon which a dispute between two of the greatest powers had been relegated to the new instrument. The Council, sundered by the differences between England and France, in its turn devolved the decision upon a commission consisting of the representatives of the smaller states, who, though on the Council of the League, were not involved in the discussions of the Supreme Council of the Allies. A Belgian, a Spaniard, a Brazilian, and a Chinese were entrusted with this delicate and thorny problem. Under all the pressures which were brought to bear, this body took refuge in a compromise. Their decision was bitterly resented by Germany, but accepted as binding by England and France. It is not easy to see what other procedure could have been followed. Judged by Gladstonian standards, Germany issued from the war and the peace with many positive advantages. She had in fact realized all the main objectives of British liberal policy in the Victorian era. Defeat has given the German people effective control of their own affairs. The imperialist system has been swept away. A domestic self-determination has been achieved. A parliamentary system based on universal suffrage, to which the rulers of Germany are effectively responsible, may be some consolation for the loss of 22 kings and princes. The abolition of compulsory military service has always seemed to British eyes a boon and not an injury. The restriction of armaments enforced by treaties upon Germany is today extolled as the highest goal to which all nations should aspire. The absurd and monstrous economic and financial chapters of the Treaty of Versailles have already been swept almost entirely into limbo. They have either lapsed or have been superseded by a series of arrangements increasingly based on facts, on good sense, and on mutual agreement. The sufferings of the German bourgeois and rentier classes, the humble pensioner, the thrifty annuitant, the retired toiler, the aged professor, the brave officer, which resulted from the act of repudiation involved in the destruction of the mark largely by the German government themselves, are piteous. They may affront the justice of the German state. They have not weakened the pulsations of the German heart, nor the productive vitality of German industry, nor even the credit and saving power of the German people. Germany has lost her colonies, but she was a latecomer on the colonial scene. She possessed no territory overseas in which the German race could live and multiply. Foreign plantations, to quote the old-fashioned English phrase, in tropical lands, might be a source of pride and interest and certainly of expenditure. They were in any case hostages to a stronger sea power. Their alienation in no way impaired the German strength and very doubtfully improved the fortunes of their new possessors. Contrast for a moment the position which Germany occupies today with the doom which would have fallen upon the British Empire and upon Great Britain itself had the submarine attack mastered the Royal Navy and left our 40 millions only the choice between unconditional surrender and certain starvation. Half the severity meted out by the Treaty of Versailles would have involved not only the financial ruin of our ancient, slowly built-up world organization, but a swift contraction of the British population by at least 10 million souls and the condemnation of the rest to universal and hopeless poverty. The stakes of this hideous war were beyond all human measure, and for Britain and her people they were not less than final extinction. When we consider the fate of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of Austria itself, and of the overcrowded city of Vienna, we may measure in miniature the risks we were forced to run. In these blunt paragraphs there is an appeal to the intellect of Germany. How stood the case of France? The disproportion of national power between Germany and France was and is the main problem of the peace. A stationary population of 40 millions inhabiting the fairest portion of the globe, in contact along hundreds of miles of land frontier with a multiplying, progressing German race and state of 60 or 70 millions, is a proposition inherent with explosive quality. It is well always to talk about peace and to strive and suffer for peace, but it is better at the same time to understand the causes which lead to wars. How is a 40 million France to be defended from invasion and destruction in the next generation against a 60, 70, 80 million Germany? There was the root problem of the peace conference. We need not dive into elaborate statistics. It should be sufficient to state that after 1940, Germany will have about twice as many men of military age as France. How was France to find security against that? France was victorious. Germany was utterly defeated. But every intelligent Frenchman and German knew that though these conditions might rule for 20 or 30 years, they embodied no finality. It would have been impossible for France to fight Germany without the aid of Russia. But Russia had gone. No one could say whether, when, or in what mood Russia would reappear. It seemed at least as likely as not in the days of the peace conference that the resurgence of Russia would find her on the German side. England had the Channel, and the United States the ocean between them and these issues. There is nothing in the long run, said the French, to stand between us and invasion, but the bayonets and breasts of our soldiers. Here was the fear and the peril. It broods over Europe today. Even as I write, we see the French devoting 50 millions of their thriftily accumulated money to building a line of concrete and steel defenses to preserve their country against a renewal of what happened in August 1870 and in August 1914. Here was the root issue of the peace conference. The fear of France that she would be destroyed by Germany and her evident determination not to be guilty of imprudence in a matter of life and death. But, it was said, the growing moral sense of mankind will prevent such a downfall of civilization ever happening again. The Covenant of the League of Nations guarantees to each member state the independence and integrity of its territory. To which the French replied, "Did treaties protect Belgium?" But, it was urged, the world has learned its lesson. The Germans have learned their lesson. No one is going to fight any more. To which the French said, "We have already had enough." Finally, it was asserted that men had become wiser, nobler, more humane in consequence of 4 years of butchery and impoverishment. That one had only to look around to see how much better we were than their fathers. Trust to democracy, trust to the mass mind, trust to parliamentary institutions, trust to the sting of old wounds. But the French continued mournfully to reiterate, "We want security." On this, the United States, being perfectly safe, and England, being fairly safe, remarked philosophically, "There is no such thing as absolute security." And the French said, "In that case, we will have the best we can." Marshal Foch, with the laurels of unfading splendor on his brow and recent experiences being present in all minds, declared, "We must have the left bank of the Rhine. There is no English or American help which could be strong enough and which could arrive in sufficient time to prevent disaster in the plains of the north, preserve France from defeat, or, if she wants to spare her armies from this, to free her from the necessity of drawing them back behind the Somme or the Seine or the Loire in order to await help from her allies. The Rhine remains therefore today the barrier which is indispensable to the safety of Western Europe and thereby the safety of civilization." Then the English and the Americans said, "But the Germans live on both sides of the Rhine, and how can you rule over them?" So Marshal Foch went back to Napoleon and his Confederation of the Rhine. "It would be the duty," he said, on March 31, "to settle the political condition of the left bank of the Rhine and to endow this district with a conception that would be compatible with the freedom of nations. As a matter of fact, these countries have never been anything but independent states or odd parts of states of central Germany." The discussion was tense. Mr. Lloyd George asked 2 questions. If the Germans knew that Great Britain and the United States of America were bound to support France, do you think they would nevertheless attack? Marshal Foch answered that if they were assured that there was no danger from Russia, they would not hesitate to do so. Again, if the German army had been reduced to the same size as the British army, would they attack? Foch replied that they would, because in fact the German army would not be reduced. He also said that the existence of a channel tunnel would not make much difference. At the same time, it was apparent that the population who dwelt by the Rhine would far rather belong to defeated Germany than to victorious France. Neither did they wish to be made into a buffer state. So that at the very outset the conference was at a complete deadlock. Both President Wilson and Lloyd George were deeply conscious of the dangers and fears of France. Wilson had hoped that the League of Nations would give France, with all other nations, security against invasion. But the French, while quite willing to have the League's protection for what it was worth, sincerely disbelieved in its power. When the sanction of armed force was withdrawn from the draft of the Covenant and financial and economic boycott of the aggressor alone remained, French skepticism could hardly be challenged. President Wilson's visit to the United States and the reservations which he had felt himself forced by American public opinion to make still further weakened the resources of the League. Thenceforward it became clear that if France was to be induced to withdraw from the Rhine, some other additional assurance of safety must be found for her. Mr. Lloyd George had for some time foreseen that this was inevitable. He was even more convinced than Wilson of the dangers of subjecting German populations to alien rule. Both he and Wilson refused to contemplate confining Germany behind the Rhine. Both felt increasingly the obligation to find alternative securities. The first and most obvious precaution was the disarmament of Germany. Marshal Foch and the French military men were curiously apathetic on this point. In the armistice terms, the Marshal had not included any provision for the demobilization of the German army nor for its disarmament except the surrender of a large number of guns. It has been stated on his behalf that he did not believe that any general disarmament could be enforced for a prolonged period, and that he did not wish to put his name to terms the execution of which he could not guarantee. He profoundly distrusted all German assurances, and believed that whatever promises were made, Germany would, as soon as she recovered her freedom of action in some way or other, create and arm new military forces. Under the vigorous impulsion of the Prime Minister, the British delegates on the Disarmament Commission pressed for the most drastic measures. Mr. Lloyd George insisted that the German army should not be stronger than the British, that it should not be raised by compulsion and should not be maintained upon a short service basis. It was to be a volunteer professional army, each soldier serving on a minimum engagement of 12 years. Thus it would not have the power of developing a mass of trained reserves. The total strength of those serving with the colors was not to exceed 200,000 men. Similar proposals were made for the German navy. The French yielded themselves with some hesitation to this strong initiative. The scheme was entirely contrary to all continental ideas. It seemed to impugn the principle of a nation in arms, which was the inheritance of the Revolution and the supreme guarantee of the life and liberties of the French Republic. Nevertheless, they saw its merits so far as Germany was concerned. They stipulated that if the German army was to be thus highly professional, it should not exceed 100,000 men. To this Mr. Lloyd George raised no objection. The military terms finally agreed to are astonishing. A nation of 60 millions, hitherto the first military power in the world, was forbidden for all time to have an army of more than 100,000. The whole basis of the former military organization by which the German nation had been built up was swept away. The general staff, which had so powerfully swayed the policy of the German state, was abolished. Rifles, machine guns, and field artillery were strictly limited, and the making of armored cars, tanks, or poison gases was prohibited. No military aeroplanes or airships were to be made or kept, and the manufacture of arms, munitions, and war material was limited to a small number of named factories. The work of destroying the surplus of munitions was pressed forward with singular energy by the Prime Minister. I received at the War Office his repeated directions to enforce and accelerate it. In all, 40,000 cannon were blown to pieces and all other military materials destroyed in like proportion. Thus, mainly by British exertions, Germany was almost completely disarmed, and the whole military caste, that vast vested interest and also type of national virtue which had been the permanent agency of German might, must fade in the passage of a generation out of German life. The streams of youth and patriotism, of valor and ability which flow perennially from the German race would henceforward follow new channels, and, as in England or the United States, find other forms of national or social service. This was and is a fact of prime importance. But the French still remained incredulous and inconsolable. How long would all this last? What would happen 20 or 30 or 40 years on? No one expected a renewal of war in the lifetime of the generation that had known its horror and its squalors. These disarmament provisions would be effective in the years when there was no danger. They would cease to act at the very time when they were needed. The left bank of the Rhine, reiterated the French, was the only enduring defense. The second measure of reassurance proposed both by Great Britain and the United States and welcomed by France was the demilitarization of a broad zone between France and Germany. The treaty accordingly prescribed that all fortified works and fortresses situated in German territory west of a line traced 50 kilometers east of the Rhine should be disarmed and dismantled. All new fortifications within this zone were forbidden. Inhabitants of this zone would not be permitted to bear arms or receive any military training or be incorporated in any military organization, voluntary or compulsory, and no depots, establishments, railways, or works of any kind adapted to military purposes would be permitted to exist within the area. The permanent enforcement of these conditions would be supervised by such means and by such organs as the Allied and associated powers might decide to employ or to create. The British members of the drafting committee were impressed with the difficulty of thus disarming Germany while leaving, for instance, Poland free to develop her forces to any extent, and while Russia remained entirely outside the scope alike of the Peace Conference and the League of Nations. It was therefore suggested, it seems, by the British delegation that a preamble should be inserted to these chapters of the treaty by which the permanent disarmament of Germany was connected with a general process of disarmament throughout the world. This was fathered by President Wilson and readily adopted. It is from this preamble that the prolonged and, as they have proved, disturbing labors of the Disarmament Commission at Geneva have originated. The French constituted to argue that, admirable as these safeguards might be in theory, real as they might be in tranquil periods, they would break and fail in the generation for whose protection they were needed. One final security was therefore sought, and the idea of a British and American guarantee to France against a future German invasion rose and gradually became definite. This was, of course, as far as human arrangements extend, an absolute safeguard. It was inconceivable that any German government would invade France if such an act involved war with both the British Empire and the United States. The strength of the English-speaking world in combination was irresistible, and the experience of the war had proved that that strength could certainly be applied in Europe, or indeed elsewhere, in a military, naval, or economic form to any extent necessary, though only after an uncertain interval of time. Foch, however, continued irreconcilable, and the choice before Clemenceau was poignant. How could the dwindling, or at best stationary manhood of France, bled white by the war, hold the Rhine by military force alone, in defiance not only of Germany, but of the English-speaking world? How could he reject the all-sufficing guarantee which the two overseas giants so freely offered? On the other hand, he knew that the abandonment of the Rhine would never be forgiven by the strongest elements in France. Not even his services to France in her mortal peril would avail him. But his courage and wisdom were equal to the ordeal. He accepted the British and American guarantee, and the treaty was framed on the basis of the inviolability of the German Rhine lands, subject only to an interval of military occupation, now drawing to its close. The sequel dwells with us today. The British Parliament duly approved their treaty of guarantee. The Senate of the United States repudiated the signature of President Wilson. The joint guarantee was therefore void. The British obligation depended upon the American acceptance and fell simultaneously with the American refusal. Thus France, having bound herself by treaty to give up the Rhine, was deprived of her compensating security. Isolated and, as they claim, deceived and deserted, the French people have fallen back on their own military force, upon technical equipment, upon African reserves, upon fortifications and military conventions with Poland and other new European states. There will be more to be said on the general question when we come later on to the Treaty of Locarno, but those who deplore these developments and criticize their evil features would do well to study their causes as well as their effects. The fierce stresses of the settlement of the German peace terms had exhausted for the time being the energies of the triumvirate. It was natural that they should shrink from immediately plunging into the less crucial but nonetheless important and even more complicated problems of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its fate. Some lassitude was inevitable and perhaps excusable. Numerous commissions had long been working upon the various aspects. It seemed sufficient at the moment to give a general direction to these commissions and to the drafting committee of jurists to apply the principles of the treaty with Germany in framing the treaties with the other defeated states. But the principle of self-determination, which had preserved Germany as the greatest united branch of the European family, was finally fatal to the empire of the Habsburgs. Moreover, in this vast scene, the decisive events had already taken place. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had in fact shivered into fragments in the last fortnight of the war. On October 28, 1918, Czechoslovakia had proclaimed itself and had been recognized by the Allied and Associate powers as an independent sovereign state. Strong in the memories of the Czechoslovak Army Corps and in the influence upon the allies of Masaryk and Beneš, the Czechoslovaks successfully presented themselves at the peace conference not as part of an enemy empire defeated by the Allies, but as a new state technically at war with Germany and Austria and awaiting peace settlements with both these countries. A similar metamorphosis had accompanied the creation on December 1, 1918, of Yugoslavia. Formed from the union of the victorious Serbians and the defeated Croats and Slovenes into a southern Slav kingdom of approximately 13 million souls. This new state was also promptly recognized by Great Britain, France, and the United States. Italy, however, demurred. The Croats, they complained, were enemies who had fought hard and well against Italy throughout the war. Whatever might be said of Bohemia and the Czechoslovaks, the Croats had no right to change sides in the moment of defeat and, by a judicious dive, emerge among the victors. However, the force of events prevailed. The Croats sought, and the Serbians accorded shelter and status as a friendly people forced into war against their will by a defunct and guilty imperialism. Their claims were recognized by Italy in April 1919. Hungary had also seceded from the empire and proclaimed herself an independent monarchy. Austria, isolated with the ancient and cultured capital of Vienna in her midst, endeavored to tread a similar path. The Austrians proclaimed a republic, declared that they were a new state which had never been at war with the Allies, and pleaded that its people ought not to be penalized for the misdeeds of a vanished regime. These transformations confronted the reunited Council of Four with novel problems. The representatives of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were ensconced as friends and in part as allies within the charmed circle of victory. The Austrians and the Hungarians, who had fought at their side on the same fronts and in the same armies, sat outside under the shadow of defeat and the stigma of war guilt. Although the ruling class in Austria and Hungary bore an exceptional responsibility, it was absurd to regard the mass of the populations of any of these four states as peculiarly innocent or culpable. All had been drawn by the same currents irresistibly into the vortex. yet one half were to be cherished and the other half to be smitten. Two soldiers have served side by side, sharing in a common cause the perils and hardships of the war. The war is ended, and they return home to their respective villages, but a frontier line has been drawn between them. One is a guilty wretch, lucky to escape with life the conqueror's vengeance. The other appears to be one of the conquerors himself. Alas for these puppets of fate! It is always unlucky to be born in the central regions of any continent. It was to this strange and tumultuous scene that the peace conference endeavored to apply the principle of self-determination which had governed the German treaty, and thus redraw the map of Central Europe. The word Czechoslovakia was new to British ears, but the ancient kingdom of Bohemia and Moravia, where the Czechs lived, stirred popular memories of King Wenceslas on the feast of Stephen, of blind King John of Bohemia at the Battle of Crécy, of the Prince of Wales's feathers with its German motto, Ich dien, and perhaps of John Hus of Prague. Here were time-honored tales. For several hundred years we had lost sight of Bohemia. The personal union of the crowns of Austria and Bohemia, effected in the 16th century, had made the head of the Habsburg Austrian Emperor and King of Bohemia. The torment of the 30 Years' War scarred forever the history of the two countries. Bohemia, persecuted for Protestantism, became partly Catholicized under duress. From 1618, after the total defeat of the Bohemians in the Battle of the White Mountain, the Habsburgs ruled a conquered kingdom with autocratic power. The Bohemian people were never reconciled. Their national sentiment slumbered during the 18th century, but memories were long and tradition powerful. The latter half of the 19th century saw the rebirth of Bohemian nationalism embodied in the Czech movement. Popular education revived here, as elsewhere, a long-forgotten national language. The schools became the centers of strife between the Czech population and the imperial government. Lingual self-consciousness and national aspirations rose together. The Emperor Francis Joseph had been crowned King of Hungary at Budapest. But the Czech desire that he should come to Prague and be crowned King of Bohemia was obstinately and, as it now seems, insensately refused. During the war, the Czech movement developed into the demand for autonomy and thence into independence. The Czechs had been accustomed to look to Russia for sympathy. After the Russian Revolution, they turned under the guidance of Masaryk to the United States and to the Western powers. Their independence had been already recognized. It remained to define their frontiers. But here were stubborn complications. Bohemia and Moravia contained at least 3 millions of German-speaking population, often concentrated, usually in the ascendant, a strong, competent stock holding firmly together like the Ulstermen in Ireland. To exclude the German-speaking population was deeply and perhaps fatally to weaken the new state. To include them was to affront the principle of self-determination. The peace conference in this dilemma decided to adhere to the ancient frontiers of Bohemia, well defined by mountain ranges and consecrated by 500 years of tradition. Apart from some vexatious but petty alterations on the frontier towards Austria, this decision became effective. The Czechs of Bohemia had joined hands with the Slovaks. This tribe dwelt upon the southern slopes of the mountains on the north of Hungary, and stretched some distance into the Danubian plain. The Slovaks had for centuries been under a Magyar rule which they regarded as oppressive. They were a Slav people akin to the Czechs. They spoke a dialect of the same language. They wished to escape from Hungary and join the new state. President Wilson, towards the close of the war, had agreed with Professor Masaryk that the United States would support the inclusion of the Slovaks in the new Bohemia, and on this Czechoslovakia had, as we have seen, proclaimed itself a sovereign state. The drawing of the frontier between the Slovaks and the Magyars was in any case a task of difficulty. No line could have been drawn to which there were not valid objections. The natural bias of the Commission was in favor of the Slovaks, and in the result about 1 million Magyars found themselves included against their will within the limits of Czechoslovakia. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia had formed itself by the union of the old Kingdom of Serbia, augmented by the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the Croats and Slovenes. The Croats had for centuries been under the Hungarian crown. They were not downtrodden like the Slovaks, but a home rule movement was in progress among them by constitutional and legal methods before the war. The Dalmatians and the Slovenes, who inhabited the mountainous country north and northwest of Venice and Trieste, were subject to the Austrian crown. Both these populations sought a new allegiance, and the new Serb-Croat-Slovene kingdom, denoted by the initials SHS, entered upon the troubles of existence. Again, the limits of the new state had to be determined. The frontiers of Yugoslavia with Hungary presented little difficulty. With Austria they were more difficult, and at least one plebiscite was required to mitigate the sharpness of decisions. The frontiers with Italy were the most difficult of all, and here victorious Allied governments faced each other in armed menace. The Italian frontiers of Yugoslavia were eventually settled by separate negotiations between the two countries. Romania, like Serbia, was to gain a great accession of population and territory. The crescent moon of the Romanian map waxed to full by the incorporation of Transylvania. The problem of Transylvania was insoluble by the principle of self-determination. It presented the feature of a considerable Hungarian population isolated within a Romanian border belt. The peoples of the Romanian zone wished to join Romania, those of the Magyar nucleus to adhere to their kinsmen in Hungary. Either decision would have conflicted with self-determination. The issues of principle being thus physically excluded and the integrity of Transylvania being an important factor, the peace conference transferred the whole country to Romania and thus alienated at least another 1 million Magyars from Hungary. The new limits of Hungary and Austria were the result of these events. Hungary lost Slovakia to Bohemia, Croatia to Serbia, Transylvania to Romania. She was also required to cede to Austria a considerable German-speaking area near Vienna, which was essential to the food supplies of that forlorn capital. It happened unluckily for the Magyars that they had lost command of their own government in the critical period of the Paris Conference. A communist revolution had erupted in Budapest. Bela Kun, a disciple of Lenin and a paid tool of Moscow, had seized power and had used it with cruel violence and tyranny. The Supreme Council could only expostulate. It therefore expostulated, but the Romanian army was in Transylvania. Attacked by communist rebel, this army advanced as invaders of Hungary and were at first welcomed in the guise of deliverers by the Hungarian population, whom they mercilessly pillaged. The Hungarian people were therefore at their weakest when the crucial issues of their future were to be decided. Not only were the various subject races, which Hungary had in the course of centuries incorporated, liberated from her sway, but more than 2.5 million Magyars, a fourth of the entire population, dwell today under foreign rule. Austria is the final remnant. With Hungary she bore the whole blame and burden of the once mighty Habsburg Empire. Reduced to a community of 6 millions around Vienna and in the Alpine lands, with the imperial capital of 2 millions in its midst, the state of Austria was pitiful indeed. The frontier had still to be drawn between Austria and Italy. The secret Treaty of London had promised Italy the line of the Alps, but in the South Tyrol, the land of Hofer, 400,000 German-speaking people of the upper valley of the Adige lived south of the Alps. Italy claimed her treaty rights, and England and France were bound. President Wilson was free, and his problem was painful. On the one hand stood the principle of self-determination, on the other the Alps, the treaties, and the strategic security of Italy. In April, President Wilson withdrew the opposition he had hitherto maintained, and the southern Tyrol passed to Italian sovereignty. It should be added that in all the treaties constituting the frontiers of the new states, precise and elaborate provisions were inserted and accepted providing for the protection of minorities, their good treatment and equal rights before the law. Italy, as one of the victorious great powers, was not called upon to assume a treaty obligation for the protection of minorities. She instead voluntarily declared her solemn resolve to accord them the consideration and fair play which were their due. The inhabitants of the South Tyrol may therefore base themselves directly and in a peculiarly personal sense upon faith and honor of the Italian nation. In her miserable plight, Austria turned to Germany. A union with the great Teutonic mass would give to Austria a vitality and means of existence from which she was cut off by a circle of resentful neighbors. The new Austrian government, appealing at once to the right of self-determination and of nationality, claimed to become a part of the German Republic. Theoretically, upon Wilsonian principles, this demand, the Anschluss as it is called, was difficult to resist. In practice, it was loaded with danger. It would have meant making the new Germany larger in territory and population than the old Germany, which had already proved strong enough to fight the world for 4 years. It would have brought the frontiers of the German realm to the summits of the Alps and made a complete barrier between Eastern and Western Europe. The future of Switzerland and the permanent existence of Czechoslovakia alike appeared to be affected. A clause was therefore inserted both in the German and Austrian treaties forbidding such a union except with the unanimous consent, presumably unattainable, of the Council of the League of Nations. The exclusion of this alternative for the gravest reasons of European peace made it the more necessary to improve the conditions in the new Austria. This required a speedy recognition of the Republic and the greatest care to lighten the financial burden imposed upon it. Notwithstanding the urgent representations made by those Englishmen who were actually in Vienna, the whole Austrian question was for months completely neglected. When at last the drafting of the Austrian treaty began, the different commissions endeavored to apply to it the terms of the German treaty. This meant that the whole financial burden was to be laid upon the small Austrian Republic, together with Hungary. The reparation clauses technically imposed the onus of paying reparations for the whole of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy upon these two small derelict states. This pure nonsense could of course never be applied, but a needless and dangerous delay arose. The complete financial collapse of Austria followed, and a social collapse was only averted at a later stage by the intervention of the League of Nations at the instance chiefly of Mr. Balfour. Bulgaria was better treated. She missed the hiatus and inertia which followed the Treaty of Versailles. She profited by the recoil from the decisions of the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Her population was scarcely at all reduced. Her economic and geographical needs were studied. She was assured of commercial access to the Aegean. Yet the griefs of the Allies against the Bulgarians were not light. The cold-blooded entry of Bulgaria into the war, the historic ingratitude which this act involved to Russian liberators and English friends, the stabbing of struggling Serbia in the back, the frightful injury inflicted thereby upon the Allied cause, the war crimes committed on Serbian soil, all these made a long and dark account. Dr. Temperley states in his history of the peace conference that the Bulgarian delegation was surprised on their arrival at Paris by the fact that no one wished to shake hands with them. And a pregnant footnote sets forth many gruesome explanations of this coolness. Yet the Bulgarian treaty was drafted in a far more instructed and careful mood than that which had regulated the fate of Austria and Hungary. The experts were becoming adept in the work of treaty-making. The best and ablest officials were acquiring control. The passions and interests of the great powers were not involved. They were indeed benevolently indifferent. The worst complaint of the Bulgarians was that they were forbidden to have a conscript army and that their people would not become professional soldiers. For the rest they were a warrior race, industrious and brave, apt to till and defend their soil or take the soil of others. They sat on the ground floor of life's edifice, with no great risk of falling further. It was accepted they had been driven into war by King Ferdinand, and with his departure into luxurious exile, the wrath of the Allies had been sensibly appeased. It is with the general aspects of the territorial settlements with the Central Powers and the principles underlying them that this chapter is mainly concerned. The peace with Turkey and the treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne require separate treatment. The dispute between Yugoslavia and Romania about the Banat of Temeswar, the quarrel between the Poles and Czechs about the Duchy of Teschen, the problem of the Carpathian Ruthenes, and the larger difficulty of eastern Galicia are complications with which this brief account cannot deal. It is obvious how many points of friction remained to cause heartburnings to the populations affected, and anxiety to Europe. But a fair judgment upon the whole settlement, a simple explanation of how it arose, cannot leave the authors of the new map of Europe under any serious reproach. To an overwhelming extent, the wishes of the various populations prevailed. The fundamental principle which governed the victors was honestly applied within the limits of their waning power. No solution could have been free from hardship and anomaly. More refined solutions in the disputed areas could only have been obtained if Britain, France, and the United States had been prepared to provide considerable numbers of troops for lengthy periods to secure a far more elaborate and general adoption of plebiscites, to effect transferences of population such as were afterwards made in Turkey, and meanwhile to supply food and credits to those whose destinies would thus be held in suspense. The exhaustion of the war forbade such toilsome interferences, nor would the scale of the remaining grievances have justified their hazards. The molds into which Central and Southern Europe has been cast were hastily and in parts roughly shaped, but they conformed for all practical purposes with much exactness to the general design. And according to the lights of the 20th century, that design seems true.